Welcome everyone to the Public Policy Masterclass Series, Part 1, Public Policy 101. So what is public policy? There are many definitions, but the one that UCL Public Policy has adopted is
that public policy can be seen as the process by which governments make decisions around how to implement their vision and create real-world impact. And informing policy with evidence is part of this process. And so it's helpful when we're approaching academic policy engagement to recognize that the UK is split into three different branches of public policy. So here we have a diagram that shows the separation of powers in the UK. So first we have the executive, whose role is, can be described as making decisions. And in the UK, this is called the government. And the government is made up of the Prime Minister and his cabinet and his ministers, who are supported by the civil service and civil servants. So the political party who wins the most seats at the general election becomes the government for the next 5 years. So right now our Prime Minister is Boris Johnson with the Conservative Party. Next is the legislature, whose job it is to pass legislation. And in the UK, this is the Parliament, and it's split up into the House of Commons, where people are elected, and the House of Lords, where people are appointed. And the government, so the cabinet and the Prime Minister, cannot make new laws or raise new taxes without the Parliament's agreement. And so I was getting confused when I was putting this together between the government and Parliament. And so it was handy for me to think of the government as a Prime Minister and his cabinet and the civil service that supports that, and Parliament as the two houses. And finally, there's the judiciary, who enforce the law. And each of the different branches of public policy require different kinds of evidence throughout the policymaking process. And we'll go into that in more detail throughout the presentation. So I think we've all been here. We've done our research, we've published our papers, and then we think, okay, now what? But one of the least effective ways to use research for influence is to write a paper and then say, right, so who do I send it to? And I think if we get to this endpoint, there's a good chance that if we do approach people, they'll say, who are you and why should I be interested? So it's more effective to think of policy engagement as a long-term relationship. So we're not looking at short-term flings, we're looking at long-term relationships. And we need to realize that relationships with policy professionals requires that we see these people as human beings too. And there's empathy. Empathy is important for realizing that the pressures that ministers and civil servants are under, including being accountable to number 10, having large portfolios, and local constituent portfolios as well. So something that I found helpful is sort of having this flow chart, this diagram of the policymaking process. And again, because policymaking is not a linear process, it's kind of, we have to create this diagram, you kind of have to arbitrarily choose this process, but you have to recognize that you might start and then start sending an agenda, look at a problem, but then you might need to revise the agenda. So very briefly, the process starts by diagnosing a problem. So what's known about the issues, causes, effects, and scale. And so in this evidence gathering process, Parliament might engage with researchers and academics by putting out consultations and calls for evidence through selecting committee inquiries, which we'll discuss later. Then there's a proposal, so what's been tried before or elsewhere and has it worked? Looking at the costs and benefits and using evidence to inform the models and assumptions. And then sort of this end part, which again is not sequential, you'll then be passing new laws if appropriate, implementing these, and evaluating whether this implementation was successful. And again, each stage of the process will require different types of evidence. So for example, if a select committee is scoping for a policy area, then it's usually a need for dispassionate analysis or engagement that you want to provide, where you allow the evidence to speak for itself. So throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, I've been working on 2 submissions to select committee inquiries, one for the Science and Technology Committee. And when we reached out to UCL academics, many of the academics who were on the first line wrote back to us and provided evidence, but because they were so involved with this area, I got text sent back to me in bold, caps locked, red, which was understandable given just how dire the situation was in some hospitals. But obviously, having something in bold caps lock where you're essentially shouting at Parliament was not going to be going over well. So I had to somehow translate the evidence into a neutral way that still was able to convey the urgent and dire state of some areas. So now we talk about who are the policy professionals. And I just wanted to add a caveat that in UCL public policy, we refer to people as policy professionals as opposed to policy makers. And that's because a policy maker is a bit more of a narrow term, because often under the people who work in policy might not actually have the decision-making power. And so we've adopted the term policy professional because it's a wider umbrella that encompasses more people. So you'll have the visible and formal decision makers. And for example, that would be government ministers, parliamentarians, and the civil servants. But then there's sort of the hidden or the non-obvious groups of people who inform policy, and that might be think tanks, private sector lobbyists, campaigners for charities and non-governmental organizations, and even academics such as ourselves. We also have to be aware that all the groups, the visible policy professionals, the non-visible or hidden ones, are operating within an invisible culture of beliefs, social norms, and behaviors, and that the media, these groups often respond to the voice of media and voters. And again, if you have any questions at any point, just use the raise hand option or type in the chat box. My colleague George, who's also part of the UCL public policy team, is also listening in the background. And he has a wealth of experience and should be able to, between the two of us, should be able to answer any questions that you might have. So again, this is just a very sort of whistle-stop tour of who the policy professionals are. In the transcript that I'll be sending you, I've provided some more links to where you can find more information about who people involved with policy are. So some other reasons for why you might want to engage with policy is so that you can shape and change the policy agenda. It's also a way for you to raise the profile of your research and broaden its dissemination and grow your own network. By having your research in the quote unquote real world, you might be able to develop new research questions and projects that are shaped by real world questions. And then a very tangible reason might be that by engaging with policy, you're able to achieve greater research impact in the Research Excellence Framework, REF framework, which is tied to significant funding allocations and explicitly requires universities to demonstrate their impact on non-academic stakeholders. Since 2019, the Knowledge Excellence Framework has required universities to report on how they exchange knowledge. And so this might also be a tangible way that you might be able to leverage your research for future funding allocations. Parliament is just one subset of the policy world and the policy community. There are other bodies such as the government and the third-party organizations, but we're putting a specific focus on Parliament because there are clearly defined routes and ways for people to engage with Parliament. And so for the purposes of this training, we'll be providing examples for Parliament just so that people can sort of get a taste and get their feet wet. So to find out what Parliament is interested in, you can consult the calendar of scheduled business in Parliament. You can consult the early day motions, which are put forward for debate in the House of Commons, and it allows members of Parliament to draw in attention to an event or cause. You can consult petitions, and you can also consult the Queen's speech. So this is what the Queen delivers at the start of every session, and that will set out the broad categories and themes that the government will be focusing on. So that kind of gives you an overarching view of what Parliament is interested in. In terms of finding out what interests the third-party policy stakeholders like think tanks or private sectors, there's actually a lot of ways. So if you know of a stakeholder, you can check their strategic documents. They'll often have strategic reports. Some might have research priority documents. So if you have a look on their websites, you should be able to find information there. If you also look to see a list of the webinars that they are hosting, that'll give you an idea of the topic that they're interested on. Use your internet stalking skills, and you can find them on Twitter, and this is also a good way to see what they're active with, who they're engaging with, and on what topics. It's really useful to sign up to the mailing list, so that way you get information, their newsletters, straight to your inbox. And also speak with staff. So don't be afraid to sort of send an email to the either an admin email or a communications officer, explain who you are, why you're from, and why you might be interested in speaking with someone. And then with think tanks, they often host the all-party parliamentary groups, which I'll discuss later. But when you look for think tanks and you see that they're hosting a APPG on a certain topic, then that's an indicator of what they're interested in. So then, how to engage with policy professionals. So again, we'll first thinking about parliamentarians. There are many clearly defined routes that are really useful for academics to be aware of. And I'm just going to give you a whistle-stop tour now, but our third part of this masterclass series, which we're hosting in conjunction with the Alliance for Useful Evidence, will provide hands-on workshops for how you actually go about engaging with these specific routes. So the first route is with select committees, and I alluded to this earlier in the presentation. So select committees, for example, the one that's probably most relevant to a lot of people on this call are the Science and Technology Committee. There's also the Select Committee for Digital Culture, Media, and Sports. And these select committees are made up of members from both parties, and there's select committees from the Commons and from the Lords. And when they announce an inquiry, they invite the public, including academics, to submit written evidence. And in the Commons, they're referred to as terms of reference. So right now, there's a lot of calls for evidence out in relation to COVID-19. And so this is a way that you can respond to the inquiry and present the evidence and your knowledge and expertise in this area. There's also public bill committees. So after the second reading of a bill, it's often referred to a public bill committee for scrutiny, and they may choose to receive written and oral evidence, including from academics. There's the Parliamentary Office of Science Technology, and when researching a post note, staff will engage academic literature and directly, as well as directly with academics. So post notes are like briefing papers on a specific topic, and so they might reach out to experts in the area for insights into academic literature. You can also contribute to a briefing or a peer review through either the Commons or the Lords libraries, and library staff may draw on academic research when they're drafting briefings and debate packs. To find out individual Lords, members of the House of Lords or members of Parliament, you can access full transcripts of the Prime Minister's questions. You can also go on their individual web pages or Twitter accounts to see what they're interested in. And you can also access on the parliamentary website a voting history, so you can see how each member has voted on specific bills and questions. And there's also Hansard, which you can which is a compilation of documents from Parliament that you can also consult in order to, if you want to get the ear of an individual. I think sort of one of the most accessible ways for people, for early career researchers or academics to get involved with Parliament is through the all-party parliamentary groups. And these are less formal groupings of MPs from, so it's less formal than the Select Committee. And these are, again, MPs from both parties who meet to discuss more specific topics and aren't necessarily tied to a government department, whereas the Select Committees are more tied to government departments. So they have membership from both parties and from both houses, so both the Lords and the Commons. They hold roundtables and invite speakers to provide briefings. So this is another way that you can provide evidence, or you can even be invited to speak to provide evidence during one of their roundtables. Right now, during COVID-19, a lot of these are live streamed. So the Select Committee inquiries, the oral evidence sessions are live streamed. You can't ask any questions, but you can watch live. But with the APPGs, what's really great is that not only can you watch, but there's also a Q&A period with the audience afterwards. So that's a way that you can engage with them. And with the speakers that they invite, there's normally at least 5 to 6 people that they invite. You can get an idea of who the experts are, the other experts are on the area. There's like 100 or 200 different APPGs. And when I say they're on every topic, it is literally every topic. So I'll be including this link in the document that I'm circulating later, but there is literally something for everyone. So the cats, veganism and vegetarianism, Scotch whiskey, pubs, which is probably on the top of everyone's mind lately, video games, darts, cider. So if you have a specific interest or something, or if your research is in a niche area and you think, oh, maybe there isn't much interest in it in Parliament, think again, because there probably is an APPG that's relevant. So it has been acknowledged in a lot of literature and in a lot of blogs that the diversity in the research evidence that parliamentarians access is sorely lacking. And that often in the past, Select Committee inquiries and oral presentations are often by, well, but not to mince my words, old white men, or quote unquote the usual suspects. So the same people will be called to present evidence time and time again. But there has been a recent acknowledgement that there is a need for greater diversity and inclusiveness in the type of evidence that's received. And in 2019, the House of Commons Liaison Committee report outlined ways that they were going to broaden the effectiveness and reach of select committees, and acknowledge that there is an increased need for engagement with the research committee. And so actions that have actually already taken place building on this recommendation are that the POST, which is the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, is offering training for academic researchers, and have also, well, they were intending on providing training as well for Black and minority ethnic researchers, but that had to be delayed due to COVID-19. If you go on their website, you'll see that there's training for academic researchers, and they are actually starting to release new dates. All of them had been postponed because of COVID-19, but I've seen that there are some dates now for September and October, I believe, within each of the devolved nations. There isn't a date set yet for England, but if you keep checking back on their website, hopefully there is a date for England shortly. And again, I've provided all of these notes and all of these links in the document that I'll be circulating later. But it was heartening to see that they have said that they recommend that work with UKRI and other relevant bodies in building connections with the research community through outreach and the use of fellowships, secondments, and short-term attachments be taken forward by POST and the committee office. So POST also offer like policy fellowships and placements for researchers and academics to join the department for 2 to 3 months, and you're involved with things like working on post notes. So those are like the briefing notes and other documents. So that I think if you're interested in getting more experience with that, I would definitely encourage you to do that. Isabel, I think you're on the line, and I know that you did a policy fellowship with Go Science. I wasn't sure if you might be willing to just give a little description of your experience with that.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So during my PhD, I did a UKRI policy internship at the Government Office for Science, which they shortened to Go Science. I was there, the internship is funded for 3 months full time. And while I was there, I was working on, you get placed doing lots of different things in Go Science. It's kind of like the hub of science in central government, I guess. But I was working on the areas of research interest, which are a series of documents published by, I think it's like 15 government departments, explicitly stating what their sort of research needs are, as a way of improving the dialogue between government and academic researchers. So 3 months went by really, really fast. It was so interesting to see how science is used by government and how Go Science is trying to improve how it's sort of sought and then sought out and then actually sort of implemented into evidence-based policy by different government departments. And I would say probably one of the most interesting things was, because Go Science isn't really attached to a specific government department, it was based in Bayes, but it's basically an interdepartmental department. So you kind of saw how different the different departments are, and their approach to using science and research, and the mechanisms that they have to reach out. So it was originally only 3 months, but I actually extended it because I was having such a great time. But then I had to leave so I could finish my PhD. But it was a really great scheme to, like, as a researcher, to see how science is used in government, and I mean, science in its most broadest sense, I think. So yeah, happy to answer any questions around that, if anyone has any.
And how did you go about getting the placement? Was that, you said it was through UKRI?
Yeah, it's they run it, well, they did run it every year. I don't know if they'll do it again this year. But it's sort of a standard application process. You sort of apply, answering questions around your motivation around it and why you're applying to your host department, because as you can be placed in lots of different departments through the scheme, including post, and some other ones I can't quite remember. There's lots of options. I chose Go Science because I was really interested in sort of central government, I guess. Sort of, yeah. But I had to write a post note for my application, so a kind of 2-page summary around sort of a research area that had policy implications that wasn't actually my research, so it had to be different. And then you have an interview. So I think it was kind of like, yeah, it's a scheme that's run every year, and I think it tends to have that structure.
Mm-hmm. And was it funded?
Yes. So basically, what it basically adds 3 months of funding to the end of your PhD. So you're on your PhD funding while you're in your place through your internship, and then you get an extra 3 months of funding at the end of your PhD. Well, I'm happy to share my email address if anyone wants to follow up with me around that.
Oh, that'd be great. Maybe do you want to put it in the chat, and people can have that there? Thank you.
No problem.
And since we've had this little pause, are there any questions up to this point about any of the content that's been shared? I just saw that George confirmed in the chat that there really is an APPG for everything, everything, every topic you could possibly imagine.
Yeah, there's something like 700 in total, I think.
Oh, okay, so I definitely lowballed it at 1 to 200.
That includes one for almost every country as well.
Yeah. And George, with the APPGs, how do they sort of feed back into the work of Parliament? Sort of what role do they play?
It can be quite mixed, and it really speaks to the specific APPG and who is chairing it, and in fact who the coordinators are. So some APPGs are run by parliamentarians from their office, largely as a way of MPs to meet and socialise. So the wine and spirits one, you could speculate maybe that way. Some of them are run by lobbying groups or kind of companies who wish to influence Parliament. So, for example, there's ones on betting and vaping, which are run by lobbying companies. But some of them are also run by think tanks and do much broader work and kind of back the groups up with a secretariat who might coordinate events, do inquiries, host commissions and reports even. So it can be really hard to tell without kind of engaging in them specifically. But you can see on Twitter as well, often if you look up APPG, kind of to judge its level of activity perhaps, or to go on the website. In terms of what function they serve, I think a lot of them can act as really useful groups for parliamentarians to engage with companies and charities and groups outside of Parliament. So for example, I used to be the secretariat for the manufacturing APPG, and we facilitated lots of meetings that allowed MPs who were interested in the topic to really draw on the expertise of companies and academics as well. So they can be really useful for informing parliamentarians, and again, for feeding into debate, Prime Minister's questions, and also for responding to consultations, things like the industrial strategy. A huge number of APPGs facilitated really great engagement with business, industry and academia around that to feed into the shaping of the industrial strategy through parliamentarians. So yeah, it's very varied. It's quite, sorry, that was a very long answer because the answer is quite complicated.
Yeah.
But like you said, Audrey, there are so many groups out there. And I can see, I think somebody, China Hansen has shared the link to the list of APPGs. There are, I'd recommend trying to see if there's one particularly relevant to your work and engaging.
Yeah, so the APPGs as well as the select committees, I know with the select committees, they have clerks who are sort of the designated point of contact. And so, and they're very approachable. And I know I've emailed the clerk for the Science and Technology Committee, kind of not expecting to hear back, but I did hear back within a day, and they're very approachable. So if you have any questions, if you have any questions about guidance for a sort of formatting or the content for an inquiry, they're very responsive to that. So there's also ways to engage with other policy professional groups. So within government, Isabel mentioned the areas of research interest. So each department has an area of research interest, which is sort of a key indicator for the strategic research questions that a department would like research input into, in both the short and medium terms. And these questions are published and are a good place to start in terms of starting a conversation. But aren't sort of an end in of themselves. But if you're sort of in the very beginning stages of your research and you're trying to look for a scope or sort of focus, having a look at the ARIs is a really useful way to sort of providing a framework and sort of a direction for your research. You can also consult with the local governments to see what sort of the more local concerns and issues are. There's also advisory committees. So many government departments maintain scientific or social science advisory committees, which will seek to draw together academic experience to inform policy development. And so details on the advisory committees will be published on the individual department websites. And I saw in the chat that Isabel has included the link for the ARIs, and I've got all of the links to the ARIs, to the post notes and the APPGs in the document that I'll be circulating afterwards as well. There's also government consultations, which I think George had mentioned. So the government routinely runs consultations on a new policy proposal. So this is where the APPGs might convene an evidence session, but these are open. These consultations are open to anyone, and you don't need to sort of be part of a large research team or research institute. You can submit evidence yourself as a researcher. And the chief scientific advisors and sort of their deputies and their networks is also a way to engage with government. And UCL actually has a strong history of our professors and academics being appointed to being chief scientific advisors. So currently, Professor Alan Penn, who is the former dean of the Bartlett, is the CSA for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Sir Patrick Vallance, who we will have seen often throughout the pandemic, is the CSA for the government and is formerly the head of medicine at UCL. And Professor Anthony Finkelstein is the chief scientific advisor for national security for the government, and he was formerly the chair of software systems engineering in UCL. There's also Professor Jackie McGlade, who was the CSA for the UN Environment Program, and Professor Brian Collins, who is the CSA for Transport and Business Innovation and Skills. And he is a professor of engineering policy at UCL. So maybe I know some of the people attending now are from engineering departments, so you might be familiar with Professor Collins. But what's really great about the chief scientific advisors is that they are academics who've been seconded into government, so to help connect research and policy, and thus they understand the importance of evidence for informing policy. They quote unquote get it. And then there's also the Government Office for Science, which has shortened its name to Go Science, which is where Isabel did her placement there, and she provided a really great overview of what she was involved with there. And they provide, the Go Science provides policy advice and scientific advice across to the different policy teams and ministers. So it doesn't actually develop policy itself, but they synthesize research and evidence and support the work of the chief scientific advisors. So they feed into the work of the CSAs. And so they're seen as a research synthesis sort of hub across government. And it is Go Science that develops the areas of research interest. And so if you have questions about the areas of research interest, you should contact advisors from Go Science. There's also the work centers, which are the What Works initiatives, which aim to support the use of evidence in policy and decision making. And so this network involves 7 different centers which collate evidence and conduct systematic reviews and policy evaluations. George, I was wondering about this. What's the difference between, do you know what the difference is between Go Science and the work centers, since they both seem to do research synthesis?
Between Go Science, did you say, and the work
Yeah,
centers?
Go Science and the What Works initiative.
I can't answer it with any degree of certainty. I can tell you what I think the difference is. Go Science is a formal department of government, so that sits within the executive, as you describe it. It's formally attached to the government chief scientific advisor, and in practice kind of sits within the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS. So there is a team of civil servants working on that. I think the What Works centres are much more a separate initiative from government and aren't formally government departments. Or maybe they're attached to them in some way, but it's kind of a less defined role. And then I think if you then look at those 2 roles, it kind of splits out what they do, which is different. So the What Works Centre is very much around what does it take to successfully implement and deploy policy, whereas the Government Office for Science kind of mirrors all the responsibilities of the chief scientific advisor.
Right.
So advising on science to government, advising on the use of science within government and all those different things, as well as coordination of groups like SAGE that nobody knew existed until February. Yeah. And everything else that kind of runs behind that government chief scientific advisor role.
Great, thank you. And then ways to engage with policy professionals who are in the quote unquote third sector or non-governmental organizations. So these would be things like charities, think tanks, learned societies or professional bodies like the Royal Society, and funders. And so again, if you're interested in trying to figure out what direction or your research should take or what research funders are interested in, organizations like UKRI and MRC will often have their sort of priority areas for research, and so you'll get an idea there of what are their priorities. Think tanks are also another way that you can engage, and as we discussed previously, some think tanks do function as a secretariat for some of the APPGs. And then, so there's policy think tanks such as the Policy Exchange and the IPPR, oh, the name escapes me. And I know, George, I know you were previously involved with a think tank. Which one was it?
So I worked, before joining UCL Public Policy, I worked for Policy Connect. Policy Exchange that you can see there is a kind of right-wing think tank. Policy Connect is a cross-party think tank, and they the majority of their work is done through facilitating and acting as a secretariat for APPGs, which is where my extensive knowledge of the APPG register comes from.
Yeah, so the think tanks, key people will often have advisory boards, which include academics. So if you're able to join any of their events or webinars, that's a great way to connect with research fellows or policy advisors who are working in relevant areas. Charities will often be interested in academic evidence that either feed into their work or specific projects. Any significant contributions or advice given are often cited in your written report. So that's another way to engage with policy with your research that's not necessarily in the parliamentary or governmental sphere. And some of them, if you look at their sort of people or contact page, if they have policy officers or policy advisors working in your area, those might be your best points of contact. Learned societies or professional bodies are things like the Royal Society, the Institute of Physics, or the British Academy, also often conduct policy work, which is generally within their remit. So definitely go on their websites as well to see what reports they've previously published and to see if there's any way that you can get involved moving forward. Prior to the pandemic, a lot of the engagement was face-to-face. So going physically to the select committee or the APPG meetings, going to events, conferences, interacting with people that way, things that are no longer possible. But now that we're in more of a virtual digital sphere, there are still many ways that you can engage with policy and with policy professionals in your quote unquote pajamas. So there's still a lot that can be done. So don't feel like sort of any of this has to be put on hold now. You can definitely engage now. So for example, you can respond to a select committee inquiry. New inquiries are being opened every day, and they'll normally have a 2-month deadline for you to submit your evidence. So you can respond to inquiry. You can also respond to consultations. Both of those are working on sort of rolling deadlines. So you just need to keep checking the pages or sign up for notifications so that you're notified when a new inquiry or consultation is opened. You can also turn your research into a briefing note. So being able to condense your research and the main findings, and sort of answering the question of why is this important into a one-pager is really important when you're going to policy stakeholders. And UCL Public Policy, we've got resources on our website on how to actually formulate a briefing note. Now's a great time also to do stakeholder mapping. So previously we suggest, you go on Twitter, see which MPs, which members of the House of Lords, what different organizations, who's active on Twitter. So use this time to sort of map out who you think your key stakeholders are, and so they have a really great picture of what's going on. I've just got a notification my internet is unstable, so please do let me know if I'm cutting out. You can also familiarize yourself with the different departments. There's so many different organizations and so many little silos that it does take time just going through the websites, putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And then also attend online webinars, training like you're doing right now, or attending APPG evidence sessions is another great way that you can get involved. Of people within SLIMS and UCL who have engaged with policy, so just to provide some mini case studies. So Dr. Vigesh Jain, he's an early career researcher. He's worked with the International Decision Support Initiative on using fiscal policy for health in low and middle income countries. So the way he engaged was he attended workshops that were also attended by senior academics and policy professionals. And he's then since collaborated with them and published papers in the BMJ. And he said that sort of his lessons learned is that sometimes the time pressures in public policy work are much greater than in academia. And he did say that he doesn't have he doesn't have many policy connections right now, but he's just getting started, and that by being able to attend this workshop, he was able to build his network that way. Dr. Sohair Al-Nil is a consultant urogynecologist and uroneurologist at UCLH. She's been involved with a number of different public policy related projects. The first one was regarding the Fistula Plus project, which was developed modules on surgical management and patient safety in Africa. The way that she was able to make connections with the WHO, USAID, the UNFPA was because they actually came to her. So they saw the research that she was doing in this area in terms of surgical management, and they approached her and funded her to do research in this area. And they had heard of her because she had been linked with the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So again, if you're a clinician or if you have a clinical background, being involved with sort of the Global Engagement Office with your associated Royal College is one way to sort of get your name out there. They were able to change the practice via national surgical obstetrics and trauma plans and introduce competency-based training in the curriculum. And her lesson learned in this aspect was that instead of criticizing governments and telling them everything that they're doing wrong, instead offer options, roadmaps, and so that governments or the organizations you work with have easily implementable strategies. Work that she's done within the UK was on female genital mutilation and the prevention and also the support of women who have gone through this, as well as she's also provided support to the House of Commons in terms of information on the issue of pelvic mesh. And so she's been involved with the Minister for Women and Equalities, NICE, the APPG on Women's Health, and in the House of Commons. The way that she was able to gain these connections and build these policy relations was through joining a charity. So there's a charity called Forward UK, which does work in this area. She approached them and they invited her to join their committee. And then it was through that committee's work that she was then asked to speak for a number of these different organizations. But again, and some of the incredible outputs was that Sudan has criminalized female genital mutilation in May of 2020, And then her research has also informed the independent inquiry into the use of pelvic mesh implants. Again, it became about very organically through doing research in an area that has a lot of need currently, and also being just being involved with charities in the relevant area. Across UCL, so we're not specifically in, not specifically just focusing on SLIMs, but we're with, we work across every department in UCL, and we offer routes for public policy engagement, and we want to try and connect researchers and policy professionals, translate research into public policy focused outputs, and draw together public policy related activity across UCL. So what might be what we offer you? So there is funding available to do policy placements in different organizations. There's also small grant schemes to do some policy related work. So we do offer there is money available. We have opportunities to participate in policy focused activities like roundtables, webinars, training sessions such as this. We offer advice, guidance, and training. So if you go on our website, there are pages on resources. So there are guidance documents on how to make a select committee inquiry evidence report, on how to write a briefing note. And right now our communications officer is working on compiling everything and consolidating everything into one single handbook, in that we hope to be ready in time for the next academic term in the autumn. And we also offer support for researcher-led policy engagement. So if anyone has any specific questions, I'm more than happy to help with sort of ad hoc advice. Someone from the European Institute contacted me last week, and I just spent 30 minutes over Teams walking them through sort of how you could go about formatting his response to the select inquiry. So any question that you might have, I'm more than happy for you to contact me and to offer the support that way to your team. As well, for if you have funding applications where you have parts that are asking about sort of your policy engagement, we're really happy to help you write those. And to highlight that we do have funding available for the policy placements. So do get in touch if you'd be interested in doing that. And they are still taking place even during COVID-19 remotely. And there's also the small grant scheme, which are available on a rolling basis. So there's no deadline, and it offers some funding to enhance policy engagement or policy impact from research. So that there was one question asking about the use of media for helping us to reach policymakers, and if you think this would be a useful way for sort of for communication and making connections. Maybe Evie or Olivia, what role do you see sort of the media in terms of brokering relationships?
It's an excellent way. You're probably aware that UCL is a founding member of the Conversation, and they're all geared, the Conversation is geared to take articles from researchers inside UCL and other institutions, and they have a very big policy readership. It's often really good to use the media when there isn't necessarily a policy window for the ideas that you think should be on the table, because it helps to drive public debate and public opinion, which ultimately Parliament is accountable to as they're elected. So I think the media is a really good avenue, but it's only one of the tools in your toolboxes. It's obviously a very public forum, so you kind of don't always have control over the way messages are spun. So you need to sort of think about whether you're entering into a delicate area where it's possibly more helpful to have conversations which are less critiquing of government or of Parliament. So that's just something to bear in mind, but absolutely it should be one of the routes and one of the tools that you use to do academic policy engagement. And if you haven't done so already, I would suggest writing for the Conversation, because not only are their editors very helpful with helping you to kind of construct? You get final editorial say, and your articles can be syndicated. So I've written a couple of pieces for them recently on structural inequalities, and they've been picked up in the Independent and the Times. And just to say, blogs as well are another really helpful way to kind of craft your communication skills and get your messages out there. And UCL Public Policy has its own blog, Policy Postings. So if you wanted to write for that, we're very happy to receive expressions of interest and work with you to craft your blogs.
Yeah, and on this final slide, we've also included information. So there's the link to the blog, Policy Postings on Medium, and then we also have the public policy newsletter, which sort of consolidates all the information about the UCL public policy activities, different inquiries and different opportunities as well, because there are still sort of policy fellowship opportunities that are arising even throughout the sort of COVID era. I see that we've just gone a minute over. Just quickly to answer Rachel's question about doing a policy placement.
Because to access the funding, you absolutely would need to still be part of UCL. And again, this is an issue that does come up where PhD supervisors and others are not as supportive of these types of arrangements because they feel that their students should be focusing on what is termed as more academic endeavours. You're more than welcome, I think, to bring UCL public policy in at that point to use us to get to outline to supervisors that actually this is an important part of an academic's career and career development, and it's actually now reflected in our promotions, leadership and criteria and within the research strategy. I think it can be difficult to advocate that sometimes for yourself, so sometimes using the tools around you like UCL public policy to help you do that is a good approach. But ultimately it is a discussion between you and your supervisor, and I think it's about kind of being able to lay out why this type of secondment or fellowship actually has benefits for both your research but also your communications going forward, and what it means for your career.
Thank you very much for watching Part 1, Public Policy 101, the first part of the Policy Engagement Masterclass series. Part 2 begins Thursday, July 30th with our Up Close and Policy seminar series, which features a UCL researcher in conversation with policy professionals they've worked with. Part 3, which is the Pathways to Engagement hands-on workshops, will begin in September, and please check our website for registration details.